Good afternoon and welcome to this community meeting to discuss the linkage fee that is being contemplated. If you'd like to speak or ask a question, please type your name in the chat box and your name will be called. Also, please keep your microphone muted when you're not speaking. With that, I'd like to turn the meeting over to Todd Tipton to provide an overview and then to the city's consultant, Economic and Planning Systems, to begin the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining. My name is Todd Tipton, and I'm the city's Economic Development Manager. I'm overseeing this project with Saul Blumenfeld, the city's Community Development Director. I see Saul's joined us. Hello, Saul. In late 2019, the city issued a request for proposals for consulting services to prepare an affordable housing linkage fee nexus study and conduct related community outreach. The city hired Economic and Planning Systems, EPS, to prepare the study and obtain input from community members and stakeholders. If adopted, the linkage fee would be applied to new non-residential, which is commercial, right? Commercial development on a per square foot basis. The resulting revenues would be used to create affordable housing for individuals and families at varying income levels. The Nexus study is underway and is expected to be completed soon. During tonight's meeting, the city is seeking community input before the Nexus study is complete. EPS will use the input it receives to formulate recommendations that will ultimately be presented to the City Council in January 2021. Between any interested community member can continue to provide input by either contacting me directly, and I'll put my contact information in the chat. I'll do that right now. Or going onto the city's website, and there's a link that you could either obtain additional information or you can add comments. So that's just another opportunity. We're trying to be as broadly based as we can because I know there are a number of different opinions about this. And, it'll ultimately be up to the city council as to what they want to do. Okay, so with that, one other thing, if you don't mind, let's roll through the presentation, let EPS, make their explanations. And at the end, we'll open up to questions and we'll have the dialogue then. Okay, so with that, I'd like to hand it over to Darren and Julie from EPS and ask them to make their presentation. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Todd. My name is Darren Smith. I am a managing principal with Economic and Planning Systems, and I'll talk a little bit about who we are and what we do. But before I forget it, one of the things that Todd mentioned was that the work is in progress. It is actually, the draft material is available already on the city's website. Some of you may have seen it, may have had access to it, may have comments to share with us this evening. But we have produced a draft of virtually everything that you will see here this evening is included in those draft materials. And so you can visit with those as long as you'd like and provide your feedback to Todd, as he mentioned. But there is nothing that we will be talking about this evening that it will not also be available on the city's website. So with that, again, Darren Smith with Economic and Planning Systems. Here with me this evening is Julie Cooper, also with EPS. We have been the primary staff working on this project since the spring. And what we want to talk with you about this evening is a little bit of introduction of who we are and what we've been doing, but also at a high level, what is a commercial linkage fee? Not every community has these things. Some of you may have dealt with them before and some of you may not. So it's always important to set the expectations for what this even is. Then we'll go through the math that we've done, calculating the maximum supportable nexus-based linkage fee, but also our recommendations, which are not necessarily the same as the maximum fee. So, when we get to those numbers, if they look very high for you, just hang on for another slide or two and we'll talk you down. But then we also want to have a substantial, as substantial as you need, questions and answers about the work that we've done and your thinking about this fee. We've had a series of one-on-one or one-on-a-few interviews with a number of developers and economic development folks in the city, the chamber, and some tenants and so forth. So we've been soliciting opinions, but that's what tonight is about as well, is to hear from you. And then we'll talk about next steps. So the next slide is just, again, an introduction to who our firm is. We have been around since 1983. We have offices in LA and Oakland and Sacramento and Denver. We do all kinds of urban economics with related to real estate and public policy. That's me in the upper left-hand corner before my COVID beard showed up. And there's Julie down there. We work all over the country really on matters of economic development, and affordable housing policy is one of our areas of focus. So we've done dozens of commercial linkage fees throughout the state and in other states as well. And so that is the experience that brought us to Culver City. The next slide, we'll just talk a little bit about where we've been. The council had identified back in 2019, as Todd mentioned, that the production and preservation of affordable housing is a priority in Culver City. And so there have been a number of different initiatives that the city has been considering, ranging from new construction and building rehabilitation, rental assistance, and some new code amendments. Linkage fee was one of the things that the city council was interested in, as it applies to commercial development. Some of the others pertain to residential development. So since April, we've been engaged by the city, and we went through our preliminary mathematics on the calculation of the fee and exploring what other communities have done, some nearby Culver City and others that have other comparabilities to the city. We've had a number of interviews, as I mentioned, and we did meet in September with the Economic Development Subcommittee of the City Council to give them a preview of what we had done at that point. But since September, we've been holding a series of stakeholder interviews to help inform the conversation about where, not just how the fees were calculated in the first place, but what really the implementation considerations that you all want the city to be aware of as they consider whether to do this at all, and if so, under what circumstances it should be implemented. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Julie to talk you through the work that we've done, the technical work in particular.
Okay. Thanks, Darren. And thanks everyone for being here. So as Darren said, the next few slides we'll be talking through, what is a linkage fee and how do we calculate it? So what is a commercial linkage fee? Commercial linkage fee is a type of impact fee that is charged on new non-residential or commercial real estate development. And it is intended to help support the development of affordable housing. So the sort of conceptual idea behind a linkage fee is that new commercial space creates new jobs and new workers, and these new workers have a need for housing, and some of them have a need for affordable housing. And so that is the relationship between the new development and the need for affordable housing. This is, again, an impact fee that is kind of allowed or legislated under the Mitigation Fee Act, so similar to transportation fees, parks fees, other similar types of impact fees that cities charge to account for the impacts that new development have on different types of infrastructure in a city. Linkage fees in particular are charged in many cities and counties throughout the state, including a handful in Los Angeles County, which we'll talk about a little later in the presentation. So the calculation for a linkage fee, again, per the Mitigation Fee Act, we need to establish what is the nexus or the relationship between new commercial, new non-residential development and the need for affordable housing. So we use a series of factors to get to this nexus. We are looking at the types of new jobs that would be generated by particular types of new commercial development. So the types of industries and occupations that we would be likely to see in new commercial development. And then we make some estimates of the proportion of these new jobs that are likely to earn what would be considered lower income wages. And these are based on area median incomes in terms of determining what is a lower income wage. And then we estimate the number of households formed by the workers in these lower income jobs. And we then look at what is the estimated cost of developing housing that would be affordable to these lower income households. And the next slide, I'll talk about how we do that estimate, but just for some context, when we're talking about a lower income household in Los Angeles County, we're in this particular calculation, we're using a prototypical sort of 3-person household, and based on the state's HCD, the Housing Community Development Department, based on their schedule of for affordable housing, a 3-person household earning up to about $50,700 a year would be considered a very low income household, and one about $81,000 a year up to would be considered a low income household. So these are the thresholds that we're using. So to understand what is the cost of developing new housing, and more specifically affordable housing, and specifically what is the subsidy that is needed to support the development of new affordable housing, we are comparing the development costs specific to Culver City using local market data, and comparing that to the value of these units based on what would be considered affordable rents for these lower income households, and looking at what is the gap here? What is the level of subsidy that's needed to support the development of these new units? And that's going to become then the basis of determining the fee that new commercial development would pay to mitigate their impacts in creating a need for new affordable housing. So these are kind of rounded numbers from our analysis. And as Darren said, our technical Nexus study draft is available on the city's website, so you could dig more into these numbers if you wish. But in general, we find that the cost of developing a new 2-bedroom apartment unit in the city of Culver City costs around $580,000. The value of such a unit based on rents that would be affordable to very low or low income households ranges from about $200,000 to $400,000. And so we see that there's a gap here of between $165,000 and $370,000 per unit, depending on if we're looking at a low or very low income household that would live there. So again, these are the numbers, these blue bars that are providing the basis by which we would then be calculating the maximum allowable fee. So here's a bit of a flow chart to illustrate an example of how we would get from a new commercial development to a fee, a maximum allowable, maximum justifiable fee. So, if we start with a hypothetical commercial space of about 100,000 square feet, we estimate about how many workers would be in that type of building. In this case, we're assuming about 250 workers. We estimate about how many of those workers would be earning what would be considered lower income, low or very low incomes. Here in this example, that's about 150. We figure out how many of, based on standard household sizes, how many households are formed by those lower income workers. So in this case, again, 100 households. And then depending on what their income level is, we would take the subsidy that would be relevant to the unit that's affordable to them. We would multiply it by the number of those households, and that would give us the maximum fee for this, for this 100,000 square foot hypothetical new commercial space. Now, the fee is not calculated for each new project. this specific way. You know, we do prototypical prototypical calculations and come up with maximum fees relevant to any project that falls under a particular land use. So for the city of Culver City, we looked at 6 commercial land uses and calculated again the maximum justifiable, the maximum allowable fee for each of them. So you can see in this table, we have retail or restaurants, office, warehouse, industrial manufacturing, media studios, and R&D, lodging, and assisted living. So for each of these, we are estimating the employment density. So how many workers might we expect in each of these types of developments? What percentage would be considered lower income based on wage data that we have from the Bureau of Labor Statistics? And then using the calculation described in the previous slide, we can come up with a maximum allowable square foot that could be applied to each of these land uses. And so kind of to provide a segue into the next section where I'll pass it back to Darren, it's important again to note that these are the maximum justifiable legal fees that the city could charge based on the nexus analysis. However, most cities, not all cities, are charging below the maximum levels and take into consideration various other issues, including what fees are being charged by other communities in their market and how do these fees affect overall development economics. And so that's what Darren will discuss over the next few slides.
Yeah, Julie, if you could stay there on that previous slide just for a moment. So again, as Julie was describing it, this is the maximum nexus supported fee that comports with the legal requirements, but you see that these fees in some cases are over $100 a square foot as being justifiable from that mathematical perspective. We know that that is way out of line with what could be supported while projects remain feasible. So as Julie mentioned, most communities adopt something not just less than, but a lot less than these maximum supportable fees. And so we'll show you what some other communities have adopted. Next slide there. Okay. So we looked around Los Angeles County and found 4 other communities that have these kind of fees: Santa Monica, West Hollywood, Los Angeles, and Glendale. In most of these cases, the fees are less than $10 a square foot. In West Hollywood, regardless of whether it's an office or a retail or hotel or industrial, they charge $8.92 a square foot. Glendale is $4 a square foot. Los Angeles charges $3 to $5 a square foot, depending on where in the city the project is located. Santa Monica is the outlier locally in that it has a different fee for different uses. But you see down below, we also looked at Santa Clara County because there are a lot of communities in Northern California, some of which have very similar name brand tenants that are comparable in certain ways to the economy of Culver City, that charge generally significantly higher. So that's just a matter of context there, but in some of those places they're charging as much as $37 a square foot, which still is a fraction of what the nexus supported calculations might indicate. But again, up in Santa Clara County, we have some communities that charge kind of a flat rate to different types of uses. Others make distinctions among uses. But the going rate down in Los Angeles County is more in the, again, single-digit dollars for the most part, and typically charging the same fee to all uses. And that, in some measure, that makes sense because not every building, it can't necessarily be predicted from the conception of a building exactly who the tenants will be. There are some buildings that can start as a general commercial building and end up having if it's a flex building, for example, it could have retail in part of it and an office in part of it and light industrial in part of it, R&D and studio work in part of it. So there is some merit to thinking about these things not as hardwired buildings that will only ever be what they were originally built to be. The next slide talks a bit about how we think about the impact on economics, and this is written up in more detail in the material that Todd has now provided a link to on the city's website. But the general idea is that we don't want the overall, this particular fee, but more importantly, the overall impact of all fees that are applied to buildings to be substantially greater than is being charged in other comparable communities. So we looked again at a variety of Los Angeles County communities and see what their overall suite of development impact fees are and how those relate to the estimated value of their real estate. So on the left-hand side, you see Culver City. Now, Culver City, this does not include any linkage fee. Right now, Culver City has a public arts fee that is 1% of the project value. It has a commercial industrial tax that is 1.5% of the project value. And then there's also the new development fee that applies at $1 per square foot. And historically, most of that money from the new development fee has been used for transportation projects. But among those things, it ends up being around 2.5% combined of the overall of the project. So we looked at that with the three things that Culver City applies right now. And we looked at the suite of things that Santa Monica and West Hollywood and the western portion of Los Angeles, Pasadena, Glendale, Burbank, Beverly Hills. We know these are not all of the communities in LA County, not even all of the communities that some of you have indicated are sort of your prime competitors, but it was a sample of 8 different communities to see where things line up. And we see that Santa Monica generally charges a higher fee level. West LA has a significantly higher fee level on their office development. Glendale is a little bit higher than where Culver City is. So Culver City is in the ballpark overall already without it adopting a linkage fee, but not at the high end of what some of these other communities are adopting. And so that's something that we think is very important for the city council to understand, again, what the overall fee burden would be if they adopt a linkage fee, how that would line up with other communities and how it would affect project feasibility, because the whole point of this is to continue to encourage development while utilizing the value of that development to offset some of the impacts that the community has with respect to affordable housing. But if you set the fee so high that development doesn't happen, then that's not helping anything. Slide then takes us to some of the things that we think about. It's not just about what you charge, what the dollar amount and how that applies to different uses. But we also think about whether and how to phase in the fee program. For example, some communities have said, okay, we're going to set it at $1 eventually, but we're going to go, since we have 0 today, we'll go halfway there and then a little bit more. And then in, say, 3 years, we'll get all the way to the full fee that we are adopting. And that's a measure of trying to help the land market, the development market, to kind of adjust over a relatively short period of time to the new fee program. So that's something for consideration. Whether we want to distinguish by use, I already mentioned that most of the LA County communities that have such fees do not really distinguish among different uses. That they don't charge something different for retail versus office versus industrial. And exemptions based on the size of the project. Some communities say if it's just a small addition to an existing structure, we don't necessarily want to charge for that, and things of that nature. And then how does it get administered. When is the fee collected? Is it at the building permit stage, or is it at the certificate of occupancy? And how does it get indexed over time as the economics of development will change over time? The costs of new construction will change and so forth. How does that work over time so that you're not doing this study every year? So we have some initial recommendations. And again, we've discussed these with the city. They are represented in the material that's online. The subcommittee of the city council has already seen this. So what we are recommending is that a $5 per square foot linkage fee would be in the lower middle of the range of LA County jurisdictions that have these fees. Now, it is important to note that not every community does, but those that do tend to be in that sort of $3 to $9 range, as we showed earlier. We're suggesting that the city council consider a fee at $5 per square foot. We're also suggesting that they not distinguish among the different types of uses, that retail and hotel and office and studio and so forth all have the same fee. It is simpler to administer. It recognizes that some of those buildings may accommodate different things from day one or different things over time, and trying to distinguish and predict what will be in each building is harder than it's worth. But there are other things that we definitely want your feedback on this evening, as we've received from our interviews regarding the rest of the implementation factors here. Several of our interviewees have discussed the fact that this is a hard time to be talking about adding a cost to development. We've got the pandemic, its impact on commercial development of all sorts is uncertain in terms of the durability of those impacts and the degree of those impacts. So, retail's not in a good place right now. Office is not in a good place. Hotels certainly aren't. So, that's real, and we want to acknowledge that. And I think it's important that the city council recognize that as well, and whether the addition of a fee right now is a strategically valid thing to do, or if they wanted to set a time in the future to adopt that. We're interested in your thoughts, or even a sort of objective trigger that, if rents go up by this much or vacancies decrease to this level or what have you. Another consideration, again, is the size of the development that's subject to the fee. Right now, the city can administratively approve a commercial project of up to 10,000 square feet. That could make sense as a sort of mark that any project that is under 10,000 square feet is considered to be exempt from this fee program, because it's less likely to have a significant impact on the overall demand for affordable housing in the city. But larger projects would be subject to the fee. That, again, is something that other communities do. The timing of collection, most cities adopt the fees and collect them at building permit stage along with the other impact fees that they collect. But there are a few that have considered collecting it at certificate of occupancy. That delays the receipt. It can help the developer a bit, at least on the feasibility side, but it can be hard to administer in that way because it's just an unusual way to do it for the most part. And finally, what would we do about projects that are in process? If there's a deal that's already been made for land or development or tenants, and we introduce a fee that has not been in the financial analysis for that project, that could upend things in an unfortunate way. So many communities set a date, and they say, okay, any project that was in the pipeline as of that date or will have a completed application as of that date will be exempt from this fee, but any project that comes in after that date, they will have had an opportunity to incorporate this new fee into their pro forma and so forth. So we will say, for example, that any project that has a completed application as of July 1 of 2021 might be exempt, and any project that comes in after that would be subject to the fee, that kind of thing. So those are the sorts of issues that we would very much like to get your feedback on this evening, and we welcome any questions. I think this is now the opportunity for answers, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to see one another, see chat questions, have direct face-to-face conversation if that technically works. But we'd love to hear from you at this point.
Thank you, Darren. Thank you, Julie. Todd?
So anyone that's interested in speaking, please use the hand button that's part of the program here and raise your hand, and Elizabeth will call on you and you'll have the mic and be able to speak. So
You could also put your name on the chat. I have a speakers list from people from the chat already, Todd.
Oh, fantastic, Elizabeth. Why don't you go ahead and call them one at a time, and we'll allow them to provide their comments.
Okay, so first I have to unmute each one of you. So the first on the list is Mark Littman. Unmute. Unmuted, Mark.
Hi, good evening. You hear me all right?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Great. Thank you very much for the presentation. Just for those who do not know me, I'm currently the vice chair of the Committee on Homelessness. And for the past 2.5 years, I've been proposing a major corporations tax to basically help fund our housing programs, our affordable housing and homeless services programs. And one of the things that I've been told is that this linkage fee would basically be taking the place of doing a major corporations tax. Now, I have a couple questions on this because I don't know if what this linkage fee is lining up with the need that I've been seeing for housing in our community. So I've got a couple questions for you. The first is this a one-time fee or is it a yearly fee? Also, who is paying this fee? Is it the developer or is it the business that moves in? One of the things that I'm sure you're aware of is that Culver City is now home to major tech corporations, billion-dollar corporations. But not only that, we're home to trillion-dollar corporations. Between Apple, Amazon, and HBO, those three companies alone have a net worth pre-COVID, before they made more money on COVID, of $2.5 trillion. And these companies and other multi-billion-dollar corporations looking at Culver City as a home are going to be bringing in, we're estimating, around 5,000 new employees or more that are all going to be looking for housing in our community. Now, I don't foresee any of these employees as being low-income employees. What I do foresee is that these corporations and their high-paid employees are going to wind up displacing lower-income people in our community and prevent other low-income people from gaining a foothold here. Also, I have witnessed in other communities regionally, for example, in Venice, where Google and Snapchat moved in, rents tripled overnight, and the homeless population increased exponentially. The link between these major corporations and housing is that they perpetuate homelessness in our communities. So I'm looking for a way to be able to make a progressive tax that goes after these larger corporations that can very easily pay an annual fee to the city to help support the community that they're earning so much from, so that we can help those who have the least in our community. So I'll leave it at that. I think I've given you a pretty good overview of what I'm thinking of, and I'd like to get your feedback if possible. Thank you.
If no one minds, I'll start the response there. So I heard several questions. First of all, I appreciate the perspective and your time this evening. In terms of how the fee is implemented, it would be a one-time fee. It would not be an annual fee. This is an impact fee. The standard for that is that it is paid at the time that the development happens, and then that's when you gather those resources, not on an annual basis. There are other mechanisms that communities have adopted that do something else, that are either parcel taxes or other kinds of gross receipts taxes, any kinds of things like that, even head count taxes on employment and payroll, that are more annualized and produce then an ongoing revenue stream. But that's not what we're talking about here this evening. So yes, it's a one-time fee. It is typically paid by the developer, who may or may not also be the tenant of the project. But it is paid at the time that the project is developed. And then with respect to your comments about displacement, if you looked back at the slide where we showed the different impacts and the nexus-based calculations for different land uses, we have one there that is focused on media studios and R&D that reflect those name brand companies that you referred to, Mr. Lipman. And you do note here that, as you suggested, there are a much lower proportion of the employees in those businesses qualify as lower income workers, much lower than in retail, much lower than in lodging and assisted living, especially. So on the basis of the legal nexus analysis that we do, we would not be able to justify a higher impact-based fee for them than on these other types of uses. But that is a constraint of the nexus standard, not necessarily reflective of the displacement concern that you are describing, and I think has been shown to be very real in some other communities. So as we mentioned at the outset of this conversation, there are a variety of different things that the City Council has expressed interest in because of the need for affordable housing and its growing priority to the City Council. But this is not that other suite of things. Again, other communities have adopted parcel taxes and payroll taxes and general obligation bonds that go toward housing and any number of other things that do provide an annualized revenue source for housing and homelessness. But this is not that.
Do you want to call the next speaker?
Thank you.
Thank you, Darren. The next speaker is Nancy Barba. Oh, hold on, Nancy. Let me unmute you. Nancy, you're unmuted.
Great. Thank you. I have a few questions. So I'm very interested to learn. Can you go back to the slide that you compared other cities' linkage fees, please? Great. So you recommended across the board, I believe, $5 per square foot. And in context of other cities' fees that are very comparable, is the reason for your recommendation at $5 in light of the economic impacts of COVID, or are they in light of you making some kind of assumptions in your economic analysis that Culver City is potentially less desirable than Santa Monica or West Hollywood? And I have a couple of questions, and I thought I'd just ask them like in little bits so I don't list them all out.
That's actually very helpful. Helps me to remember. So the $5 recommendation comes from the idea that you are in a competitive economic environment. And so we look at other places in your vicinity where, in Culver City's vicinity, I don't know where you are, but the idea is that most communities want to be too terribly far away from what their competitors are doing, to put it quite bluntly. You see on this chart that the Los Angeles County fees tend to be anywhere from, say, $3 to $9 for the most part. And so we picked 5 based on what the other cities are charging for this individual fee, as well as what the overall suite of fees are that are being charged, as was shown on or alluded to on the next slide, but is provided in more detail in the materials that you can access through the website. There are communities that have different kinds of fees. They have fees for transportation projects. They have fees for childcare. They have fees, some of them for affordable housing, some not. And the idea is that the overall level of fees relative to the value of the real estate that's being developed has to be in some kind of comparable range. If it gets too far out of, on the high side, too far away from that range, that your other goals for as a community may be thwarted. You have economic development goals, you're looking for a tax base, you're looking for good jobs, you're looking for other things. And if you make your fee burden so high and onerous that all these companies go elsewhere, that typically is not, for most people, considered to be a good outcome. So that's the genesis of the $5. We recommended it as much as, you know, we don't make that decision. It was a bit of a provocation, honestly, to give the council something to respond to when the time comes, as opposed to just saying, okay, what do you think? And not having something in particular to respond to. But we think it's the right scale of fee. It is consistent with other communities and appears to be absorbable within the overall economics of development.
And you know what, I think it's also important to mention that this isn't the only tool that the city's considering in order to fund affordable housing. So there are things around stabilization ordinance, inclusionary housing, you know, that applies to new residential development, that these things become cumulative. And so, you know, with those on the horizon, it's important to keep all of that in mind as we talk about these things. So, okay, Nancy, back to you. I know you have additional questions.
Yes, and perhaps a lot of these more detailed questions are answered in the report, which I have not read. But it almost seems like, and I totally understand the comparison among all the layering of fees, but it seems like we're saying we're more comparable to Los Angeles, which I'm assuming is a city, right? The city of Los Angeles, and than to West Hollywood or Santa Monica. And my understanding of where Culver City is in kind of the opportunities that it provides both its residents and its businesses is that it's more comparable to the West Hollywood, Santa Monica's of California, right? But I will take a look at the report and just kind of try to, and I get, Darren, your point of this is a number, it's something to respond to. I think my other, more of a, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, let me just jump in real quick there. If you are looking at conclusion based on what you see on this slide, number 12, that's part of the story, but also part of the story comes on the next slide, which is where we do the overall comparison of fee burdens among those same jurisdictions plus several others. And you see that even without this fee, Culver City's fee burden as a proportion of overall value, project value, is a little over 2.5%, which is already, you know, in the middle, maybe even the upper middle of what these other communities are doing. Santa Monica is higher. Some of Glendale's fees are higher. Some of Pasadena's are close and maybe a little bit higher. But this number on the left for Culver City does not include the $5 fee or whatever the fee might be for the affordable housing. And if we did roll that into this particular graphic, then Culver City's numbers would be up in the 3 to 3.25%, which would definitely put Culver City at the upper end of this sample. So that's, again, just for a little more context.
Okay, that's really helpful to understand. So if it goes to a flat $5 per square foot linkage fee, then we're more 3.25.
Yeah,
okay.
And still, but higher than most of the communities on this list.
Okay, my other question is, when did Santa Monica and West Hollywood and West LA, when did those regions set their linkage fee? And I ask this in light of there is lots of changes that have happened in our region in regards to housing and homelessness, and also in regards to the regional housing allocations, right? So my thinking is, if these were set way back when, before all of those impacts came to light, perhaps if they had the opportunity to revisit them in 2020, they may be set even higher. If you could help me understand when those were set.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we have that answer available this evening, but it's certainly something we can provide.
And Darren, I'm sorry to interrupt. There's nothing that prohibits any of these cities to go back and revisit their existing fee structure and recalculate. And that's what we plan to do. We just don't want to do it every year.
Right. That is correct, Todd. Most communities, they set the fee when it's first adopted. They establish either by ordinance or just by practice that every so often they go back, comprehensive review of their situation, develop economics, their need for affordable housing, and so forth. Communities that set that by ordinance to do it every 5 years or every 7 years, but in the interim years, they'll have some more escalators, so they don't have to commission a study from someone like us every year. But yeah, most communities do revisit these with some regularity.
Thank
Darren, you. Excuse me, Darren. This is Nancy. This is Community Development Director Saul Blumenfeld. The other issue that we need to consider, at least with respect to RHNA, is trying to understand how we can meet our RHNA target, which is quite high, which is, as you point out, over 3,000 units. And so one of the possible avenues to do that is through accelerating mixed-use development, because that's where density can most easily be accommodated. And in fact, we had a long discussion about this at Commission with respect to our mixed-use inclusionary units. So I point that out because we have to find the sweet spot, as Darren was pointing out, between getting the maximum fee and not stifling development where it can most likely occur along our commercial corridors. So that isn't to say I think we found the magic number. As Darren points out, he came up with a number that he thought might be provocative in the sense that it would stimulate council discussion. But the idea here is that we don't stifle the commercial development that might help us get to our RHNA. So that's just another consideration for you. That's all I wanted to add.
Yeah, and
I appreciate that.
I'll just mention, so I'm sharing here. I don't know how easy it is to see, but this is a collection. This is a document that has all the linkage fees in the state. And so as you can see here, LA's fee was adopted in 2017. Santa Monica's was adopted in the 80s, but updated in 2015. West Hollywood's was adopted in 1986. And then Glendale isn't on here because theirs was adopted, I want to say last year. I think, yeah, either last year or in 2018.
Thank you for that, Julie, and thank you, Saul. I appreciate you and I completely appreciate the context that we definitely don't want to stifle development. I'm just, and by the way, I'm not suggesting that we should go up to $8. It's just, you know, what is that sweet spot that we can maximize without pushing away, because every dollar or penny per square foot and has an impact. And in that regard, that's one of the things I liked about the cities that did a different type of fee per type of development, because I think the implications of offices, which are a lot of the new developments in Culver City have on our city, are bringing in very high paid workers, which are more likely to displace than, let's say, retailers that will not bring high paid workers. So that's, and I understand that this is, it's there's an art, but thank you for taking my questions.
You know, let me just add one other thing, Nancy. That is a really good point. Darren has recommended that we consider a range of things, including, you know, some kind of bifurcation of this fee among different uses, and so the work that Julie and Darren have prepared reflect that as an option. And your point is well taken, because, you know, we don't want to dampen, for example, you know, the minimal amount of retail investments that we're starting to get, but office certainly is going strong. We have a number of projects that are winding their way through the development process or in the development pipeline, and for the most part, they're all you know, they're office developments, at least right on the immediate horizon. So that's a very good thought.
And just one more thought on that subject. It is, when we calculate the maximum Nexus supported fee, we did do it in, I think, 6 different categories of employment. And it is possible to have a different fee for each of them. It is also possible to exempt either temporarily or permanently some of those categories entirely if there is an economic development objective to do so. Not every community that has linkage fees, for example, charges it on hotels or on retail because they see other benefits to encouraging those types of development, other fiscal benefits to encouraging those types of developments. So it is a balancing act about you know, what stands to benefit your community most greatly, and so that's part of the conversation that the city council may choose to take up. Who else?
Nancy, is that all?
Yes, that's all for me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The next speaker is Carlo, and Carlo, I am unmuting you. There you go, you're unmuted.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you for this evening's presentation. Very interesting. Like Mark, I'm also a member of the city's Committee on Homelessness, and I noticed that you did this presentation and got feedback from a number of members of the public. I'm curious if the Committee on Homelessness is one of the groups where you will plan on coming and doing a presentation and getting feedback, considering the impact on housing and homelessness is so high, depending on how this ends up.
Well, Carlo, this is Saul. Nice to hear from you. Yes, we could give a presentation. We're contracted with our consultants for a few public outreach meetings. We can also present some of the documentation or provide some of the documentation to the committee. But the next steps were to conduct these outreach, these community meetings. Todd or Darren or Julie, correct me if I'm wrong, but after we conduct the outreach, we were going to, I believe, get back to council to understand where they were leaning and to understand whether or not there was further, and to get further direction. So that could lead us to do more outreach. It could, I mean, you know, there's a number of things that could result. So I don't want to say we won't do that. I think we just aren't quite sure yet, but we are required to do and need to do this outreach to get the kind of input that we're getting.
That's helpful context, Saul. Thank you, and good to see you as well. Because this is something that the committee discussed early on when we were, going through our homeless plan and looking for ways to increase access to affordable housing. I'm just a believer that there's value in getting input from the whole committee and bringing that as a recommendation to the council. But I certainly do not know where in the process that should arise. I would definitely defer, but just throwing that out there as maybe a helpful step.
Right.
A couple of thoughts. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I thank you for that. We will absolutely bring that to council's attention when we provide a summary and we present the findings on the study.
Great, fantastic. A couple of thoughts or questions, I guess, as I've been listening. One of them, the money that's raised from these fees, do they go directly to building affordable housing? Are there any restrictions on how those monies can be used? Are they general fund? What's the requirements on that?
Aaron, do you want to start? I do have some partial answer.
Yeah, I'll take the last part first. They are definitely not general fund. They are required to be used to promote the production or preservation of affordable housing in the city of Culver City. So that can take a number of different forms. It can be as local match for a tax credit project. It can be money that goes toward purchasing existing units and putting an affordability restriction on them for a period of time. There's a number of different ways that it can be spent on specific properties or projects or programs, but it is definitely required to be spent on addressing the need for affordable housing in Culver City. And if it is not spent that way, then the people who pay it are entitled to get it back.
Right, exactly. Okay, well, maybe I can follow up a bit. The intent would be we've set up a low moderate income housing trust fund, and these monies would be deposited in this low moderate income housing trust fund, affordable housing trust fund, for the exclusive uses that Darren mentions. We're using that fund for other sources of as funding for other. As sources of funding for other projects. We have a number of housing programs like and Mark, you read my mind with your chat. We're looking at it for our affordable ADU program. That's very possible. So thank you, Mark, for bringing that up. We're looking at our inclusionary ordinance, in lieu fees. There may be those who want to in lieu as opposed to providing some of their units on site, and we could use those monies to bankroll the Affordable Housing Trust Fund to be used exclusively, as I say, to build affordable units or to renovate them or to subsidize units with 55-year affordability covenants. So those are just a couple of the things that we'd be looking at with these program monies. But in short, it could be used for preservation of units. It could be used for new construction of units. It could be used as subsidies to write down the cost of housing, of affordable housing. And these are some of the programs, as a subcommittee knows, we have over 24 programs, and many of these programs would be a good fit with these linkage fee proceeds.
Definitely. Okay, thank you. Do we have any guess as to how much money this might generate for the city?
Julie, I think we did some projection of that, right? Based on
Yeah,
projects in the pipeline.
Yeah, so we did do a very kind of high level estimate on our understanding of, again, kind of the city's projections for new commercial development. And so I'm just pulling up, and this is actually in one of the reports that's available on the city's website. But overall, what we're looking at is if we had a $5, if we were going to go with the $5 per square foot fee, you know, and the city is projecting about 1.1 million square feet of new development, office and retail development over the next, I believe the next 5 years. So that would be about $5.8 million that this fee could generate, again, at a $5 per square foot fee. So that's just one example. And again, we have a little bit more information in the one of the reports that's on the city's website, so you could look at more detail on some of those projections.
Right. So just to be clear, that number is definitely a ballpark number. I mean, we did our best to come up with an estimate, but really a lot depends on many things. For example, we're in the midst of a general plan update. That will make the availability of land for development and new development will definitely change, likely to change. And that would, of course, affect that number. And of course, everything's dependent on the economic conditions at the time. And as Julie pointed out, you know, we don't know what the final number will land on will be. So that these are all kinds of, you know, factors that would affect the ultimate amount that would be generated.
Right. And you know, depending on how that money is leveraged, if it's the only source of subsidy for an affordable housing development, it could yield, you know, a few dozen units. But if it is combined with tax credits and other funding, it could be several hundred units that it could provide the kind of gap financing for outside of the other sort of typical funding sources that are available to affordable housing projects of that sort. So that's the scale of this type of program and its potential effect in Culver City, especially if you can leverage it as one of several different funding resources for that kind of project.
Great, thank you. I had one other question and then one comment. The speaker just before me asked about the using five, how you came up with the $5 rate, and you showed a graph that showed that we were already sort of above average in terms of the percent of I don't remember the exact figures, but something around the amount that this is costing development in terms of fees to the city. And I wonder, where is that money going to? Since we're higher than other cities without this linkage fee, what is that money being spent on currently?
Yeah, so that 2.5% or plus or minus that you see there, 1% of that, one of the 2.5, is the public art fee. So that is collected and must be used for public art. There is a small new development fee that's $1 per square foot that has typically gone toward transportation projects. But the bulk of it, the 1% goes to public art. The 1.5% that's called the commercial industrial tax. Correct me if I'm wrong, Saul or whomever, but I think that's just money for the general fund.
Yes, that's correct. And Darren, we need to also mention that commercial industrial tax is probably 35 years old, and it needs to be updated. And we're also updating, although it's unrelated to this, our parkland fees, which are similarly out of date. So that's likely to change. And that's another consideration about, you know, getting back to Nancy's question, how we potentially affect development, because we have to look at all the cumulative fees that would bear upon new projects. So that's one of the things we've asked EPS to look at. And if there is room for these increased fees and a higher linkage fee, then we're going to definitely pursue that. But we have to really do a deep dive and understand how these various fees work together.
Thank you for all of those answers. Super helpful. I'm gonna have to give this a lot of thought now that I have these answers. But I did have one sort of quick comment, which is I know you asked about should there be some limitations to who gets charged and how do we determine which businesses or what size. And I do think that's really important. A small restaurant that's opening up is just in a different financial state. And a different impact on the city than Amazon coming in. What I don't know, so I definitely think there should be some, I don't know where it should be. I don't think we need, at this moment, should be stifling small businesses moving in, trying to open. What I don't know is whether those limitations should be based on the size of the property, the type of the property, or I don't even know if we're allowed to do this, but the financial income of the business. I don't even if we're allowed to say businesses with a payroll over a certain amount or a budget over a certain amount are the ones that are subjected to this. Because I could imagine a very small tech company, they only have 50 employees, but they're just in a different place to be able to afford this than a restaurant with the same number of people. So if that's possible, that would be something I would throw out there as something to consider. And again, thank you for the really interesting conversation. Appreciate it.
Thank you. To respond to that that notion of other ways to slice and dice this issue, there are other mechanisms, not commercial linkage fees necessarily, but other mechanisms that can be used to address affordable housing that are tied to the size and profitability and so forth. Not profitability, but revenue generation of projects. Payroll taxes are one, head taxes are another that have been adopted in places like Seattle and Chicago and other places that can be dedicated to housing and homelessness. And that's a separate thing. Again, I know that the council has expressed interest in looking at housing and homelessness from a variety of perspectives. And I think it's great to have a full quiver of arrows to fire at that particular very difficult issue. But this is not that approach. This is not one that is tied to the success of the project or the tenant. Rather, it is based on the employees of that organization and what they typically get paid and what kind of housing they typically need.
Excellent. Oops. Okay, so Carlo, thank you for your comments. And next up in the list is Lindsay, and I will be unmuting you now.
Thank you so much. The report refers to new development, and I think at the outset of your comments, you talked about the council ultimately adopting a policy potentially for a minimum number of square feet that the fee would apply to. I just wanted to make sure I was asking the question, is it your recommendation and your sense that this will proceed based on net new square footage as opposed to change of use or other factors?
What we typically see is that it is net new square footage. If it's a brand new development from dirt up, I know there isn't a ton of vacant land in Culver City, but it tends to be net new square footage is the kind of the nexus-based argument that you can make, that you are adding to the community, and some of those new employees will need affordable housing. I'm sorry, what was the second part of your?
It was really
Change
related
of use.
to change of use. Yeah.
Yes. Well, again, that's one of the reasons that we are suggesting, again, perhaps just as a provocation, that there be a flat fee for all uses, is that then it doesn't matter what the future use is. They will have paid the fee and collected it, because a change of use could potentially go both ways. If you start with a building and you assume that it's this type of employer, and then in the future it becomes something more intensive with more need for affordable housing, you may need to track who's in that building over time, and try to exact a fee that changes from time to time, including potentially going down. And are you going to offer a refund at that point? I certainly doubt it. So from an implementation standpoint, our opening recommendation is that it be on net new development and net new square footage, and that the fee be flat among uses, so that there isn't the concern about a change of use. If the council is interested in doing a more use-specific fee, then we would definitely need to have the conversation about the change of use.
Okay, but again, just then this is making sure that I've asked the question properly, and I hope that Todd or Saul will feel free to chime in as well. This is not envisioned as something that would be applicable to an adaptive reuse, correct?
I'm sorry, go ahead, Darren.
So typically, if it was a commercial use and is going to continue to be a commercial use, but there is no change in the size of that building, most communities have not adopted this as this type of fee as a resource available. But that, again, is a matter of policy. I'm not sure. I'm not an attorney, so I can't give legal advice on that. It's worth the question about whether that could apply. I just don't know exactly what the answer is on that.
Right. I was just going to say that we haven't envisioned this as a cost that would be that would inure to building rehabilitation. We've thought of it as a new construction fee. So I think maybe that answers your question, because yeah, I mean, I think that's the way we've envisioned it. But as Darren points out, this is all up for discussion by the council. To the extent it's a policy issue and it's otherwise not precluded, legally precluded. I think that's the best answer we can give you right now.
Thanks. That was my question.
All right, Elizabeth, can we call the next speaker? We're running close to our time limit.
So the next speaker is Francis. Francis, I am unmuting you now.
Thank you so much. My name is Reverend Francis Rosenau. I'm a pastor at Culver City Presbyterian Church. I'm also a resident and parent of students at La Bayona. I'm also the chair of the General Plan Advisory Committee. And so I commend you in this work tonight. This is a really exciting step where we are. My question had to do with the trust fund that Saul mentioned. Are there other sources of income for that trust fund, or would the linkage fee be the only source for that?
Right. Okay. Let me respond. Good evening. Thanks for that question. Yes, we have almost 24 housing programs that have been proposed through our housing division and have been approved for implementation by the city council. And some of the programming involves figuring out ways to supplement the housing money. We have some limited housing funds available from the former RDA. you know, the redevelopment agency. So we have some housing monies that have gone into that redevelopment trust fund, or that are being paid back without getting too much in the weeds from the state, because that money is owed to the city through a redevelopment loan from years ago. Anyway, that's a little too detailed. But so we do have funding for that low moderate income housing trust fund, partially from existing proceeds the city has from the RDA. We're also looking at it as a potential, the trust fund as a potential receiver of in lieu housing fees if a developer chooses to opt out of our inclusionary mixed use ordinance, which was supposed to go to council by the end of this year, but because the council agenda has just been so impacted, it's now going to be go to council in the early part of next year. But that's another source of funding, in lieu housing fees, that would be in that ballpark range that Darren and Julie pointed out, of that $500,000 to $580,000 per unit fee that a developer might choose to opt out of. And so those monies would be well, firstly, if the ordinance is approved and if the developer chooses to opt out, those monies would be deposited in that fund as well. We have a couple of grants, housing grants. We have Measure H monies that are a part of that fund that go into housing programs. And actually, we'll be getting into this in much more detail when we review the housing element update, which you are definitely plugged into. And we'll review all of these housing programs, and you'll be able to see how these various pieces fit together. And we didn't want to sidetrack this linkage fee with burdening the discussion with too many other details about this housing programming, because that's a whole meeting, several meetings, you know, of their own. So I hope I answered your question.
Yes, that does answer my question. And I'll keep this brief because I know we're on a time crunch. My comment is what stuck out to me from the graph with or maybe it wasn't the graph, it was the table that had the other areas. Up to now, we don't have a linkage fee, and how high time it is for us to be addressing this and stepping up to where the cities around us are and the areas around us are in order to address affordable housing. And I commend this work, this meeting. I'm definitely paying attention. I'm definitely praying for you and the commission and the council in the coming weeks and months as we take on this very important work. Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor. And the next person on the list, we have one more, which is Nancy, and Nancy has one more question. Nancy, you're unmuted.
Yes, this should be fairly quick, and I believe we know the answer, but was any financial analysis performed that would take into account the real estate transfer tax that I know just, passed this week? But I'm thinking it also, a similar real estate transfer tax, though not progressive, was passed in Santa Monica. So it'd be interesting to also see what impact that's going to have on development. And again, I'm mentioning the Santa Monica because obviously that's a city that's, we look at their figures quite a bit. So something else to take a look at.
The financial analysis that we did not incorporate the real estate transfer tax that just appears to be passing in Culver City. So we did have a conversation earlier this afternoon about whether and how to address that. And I think it's important to keep all of these things in mind as they affect the value of real estate in Culver City, again, with the interest of making sure that we're not killing the golden goose. So that is something that we can think about and certainly have a conversation with the council about as part of their consideration. Thank you for the question.
Great. And that is the end of our speakers list for now.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Great input. Again, please help us spread the word. You can provide comment between now and the time that we get back to the city council on the city's webpage. I provided the link in the chat, or you can contact me directly. Either way, whatever's most convenient. I've also included my email address in the chat. So with that, our target is to get back to the council in early January 2021, receive their direction and go from there. Carlo, we'll talk internally about, how we incorporate the committee's input, and we will, we'll get back to you on that. So just stay tuned. Thank you. I think it's a great idea. We'll figure it out. With that, that concludes our meeting. Solved. Anyone, do you have any closing comments before we sign off?
No, I just want to say thanks for participating. Great questions and comments. It's all really very helpful. So thank you.
And one other thing, this recorded, that recording, we can place on the city's website as well, so that people that might not have been able to participate tonight can obtain the same information. So I think that concludes things. Thank you, everyone. Great meeting, and stay tuned as we take this forward. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Good night.
Thank you.